In this session, we'll discuss the surprising outcomes of the early developmental efforts and why it led to widespread disillusionment. You may recall from the earliest lectures that development was conceived as a three-pronged modernization strategy, which included simultaneous modernization of the economic, political, and social spheres. There was an emphasis on big push in all three aspects of modernization. In the economic realm, it meant rapid industrialization. In the political realm, it meant rapid democratization and the creation of unified nation states. In the social realm, it meant transformation of individuals from that of colonial subject to a modern citizen with a scientific outlook. Importantly, these structural transformations were to be induced by the state, which then was assumed to be benign and neutral, but a powerful actor. As we will see, after a decade or so of serious developmental efforts, there was a rude awakening that actual outcomes were far different from what was planned for. And the blame for this mismatch between expectation and outcomes was put squarely on the state. From the late 1960s onwards, the idea of top-down, big push developmental interventions came to be seriously challenged. We'll discuss the critiques of big push in details in the next lecture, but for now, let us discuss why early developmental efforts might not have worked as planned. For one, World War II had created a global boom in the demand for all kinds of resources. In its immediate aftermath, many developing countries, such as Brazil, benefited immensely from this boom. Many developing countries, including some in Africa, accumulated capital surpluses by exporting raw materials. However, developing countries, particularly in Latin America, quickly realized that the terms of the trade for these countries were unfavorable. They had to sell natural resources to industrialized countries at prices determined by the global economy over which they had very little control. As a result, they had to pay a premium to import manufactured goods from industrialized nations. Therefore, many developing countries, starting in the 1960s, turned to a strategy called import substitution industrialization, or ISI, which advocated that all essential goods must be manufactured by domestic industry. This fitted well with big push modernization paradigms, as it gave a major incentive to establish a manufacturing base as essential for rapid economic growth. Large public sector bureaucracies were to manage this process of industrialization, either as planner regulators or as direct managers of the public sector firms. Meanwhile, by the mid-1960s, the global economy was entering a period of slowdown relative to the period immediately following post-World War II boom. This drastically lowered the price of raw materials, thereby reducing export revenues of many developing countries, which were natural resource exporters. This negatively affected the domestic economies of many developing nations. Needless to say, this did not augur well for the rapid economic development process undertaken by the new nations. There were several other reasons why the process of economic modernization did not proceed as anticipated. First, industrialization required sophisticated technical know-how. The modernization paradigm had assumed that this technology would be transferred from the industrialized to the industrializing nations. In reality, this did not happen. With the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union and the advent of the Cold War, nations in the world got divided into two camps. Technology transfer followed these alignments, and even when it happened, it was very limited and controlled. This was something that was not anticipated by the modernizers. Keep this historical fact in mind when you think about product evaluations today. Will the technology required to maintain and operate the products be freely available to poor consumers? Second, the global economic slowdown resulted in the drying up of foreign aid. Moreover, with the escalation of the Cold War and the threat of a looming international communist uprising, foreign aid, especially from the United States, became linked to fighting the spread of communism. Third, import substitution strategy did not create large-scale employment. In fact, it led to the creation of capital-intensive firms which are protected from international competition. The only sector that produced jobs were in the bureaucracy, and that too at a very high cost. As a result, the big industrial units became dead weights on the economy, putting further stress on government spending, which are necessary to keep such firms alive. Put together, all of these factors resulted in a general sense of disillusionment with the idea of big push interventions driven by the state. In the political sphere, the goal of modernization was the creation of Western-style liberal democracy and nation building. But by the mid-1960s, however, the democracy development interconnection looked problematic as increasing number of nations, starting with then development's poster child, Brazil, turned from democracies to military rule. Ironically, some of the newly authoritarian nations were propped up with US support, which feared a global spread of communism after Cuba had become communist. In addition, the nation-building project had begun to show serious strains with increasing resistance from various ethnic, tribal, and religious groups, which ironically had flourished due to democracy. The goals of a unified, homogeneous national society looked increasingly difficult without centralized control by the army. The rise of social protest by various groups, including organized labor, were interpreted as signs of impatience with capitalist economic strategies, and thus heightened further anxiety that communism was around the corner. What further added to the anxiety of the ruling regimes were rising unemployment in urban areas and stagnant incomes in rural areas. Amid such struggles, it became clear that even though the developing countries had tried hard to create the modern citizen, clan and clan loyalties and traditional social structures seemed very hard to displace because they provided a social safety net against the unpredictability of the economic decline. In other words, the early optimism of the modernization efforts was eroded significantly by the beginning of the 1970s. Meanwhile, by the middle of the 1960s, Western industrialized nations also faced economic slowdown, and there too social protest erupted in various forms. For one, starting with the publication of Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, the adverse environmental consequences of technologically driven economic growth models become a target of criticism. There was a rising critique of mass-scale production to feed the insatiable demands of consumer societies. And the critics pointed out many structural aspects of the so-called affluent societies which hurt quality of life. In addition, growing threat of nuclear wars between the two superpowers and the use of all sorts of destructive weapons in proxy wars around the world, such as in Vietnam, turned many technology proponents to become its severe critiques. Gone was the technological optimism which marked industrialization efforts in developed countries. Instead, there was a rising pessimism about the negative consequences of technology in every aspect of life, from its negative impact on household social bonds to mass-scale automation which alienated labor. What's more, technocratic mentality, which was a hallmark of modernization, proved futile in the face of social problem of racial and gender discriminations. Scholars, experts, and critics concluded that technological progress in the West had created a mass consumer culture, an environment in which there was plenty of goods, but which were produced at a very high social, political, moral, and environmental cost. What kind of evaluation techniques marked this moment of pessimism? Cost-benefit analysis, which had emerged from war planning and was the popular methodology in the earlier period, began to be questioned as critics pointed out that conventional methods of calculating costs of various kinds were inadequate. There were multiple criticisms of the monetization approach, which is central to cost-benefit analysis. The methodology was attacked as representing a particular ideology of progress, which valorized economic growth at the expense of all other quality of life indicators. In the developing countries, where many developmental projects which had either stalled or produced suboptimal returns for various reasons, there was a growing consensus that cost-benefit analysis was not an adequate methodology for pointing out how to improve project performance and policy outcomes. Albert Hirschman's seminal book, Development Projects Observed, charted out a new type of evaluation which looked into political and organizational reasons for unsatisfactory performance. This was the institutional turn in evaluation, away from its earlier emphasis on calculations of cost and benefits only. What Hirschman proposed was a new type of evaluation which was more sympathetic to the institutional constraints faced by developing countries, and it opened up a whole new vista of evaluation methods, not as clearly codified as cost-benefit analysis perhaps, but more useful for policymakers who needed to know how to move forward from the stagnation and economic decline. We'll return to the possibilities as well as limits of this method in later lectures.